Amen. It's good to be with you this morning. Man, we have like 48 students going to Beach Reach and then 56 of us total. And I was like, where is everybody this morning? But still a good time. Appreciate y'all praying for us. If you have your Bibles, turn to Hebrews chapter 11. We will be in verse 32. So we're skipping a lot of 11. We will return to it in the coming weeks. But we've been going through Hebrews for a while. So I thought it would be helpful for us to just do a quick review, just kind of make sure we have our bearings. And just want to give this as an opportunity to do like a short, tiny, teeny little Bible lesson. So just remember, most of the New Testament books are letters. They were written from one person to another person or group of people. The fancy word is epistle, just means letter. So you might see that at the top of your book. Which means that if it's a letter, then it was written as like one continuous thought. So they were sitting there writing it. And while a specific verse can and often does have an isolated meaning by itself, that's not how the verses were originally written. The chapters and verses didn't come into play until way after these letters were written. So they're best and most easily understood as a piece of the whole. So I just want to give a quick review, and I'm going to do this really fast, so try to follow along. But we saw in the first chapter, the writer starts out and just says that Jesus is God's greatest and final revelation. So with Jesus, we have all that we need to have. Then he goes on to argue that Jesus is greater than even the angels, and so we need to follow Jesus and not anything else. And then he goes on to tell his audience that Jesus is greater than the Old Testament and the Old Covenant, and so we need to follow Jesus and nothing else. Not that the Old Testament is useless and we throw it out. It's not what he argues for. But he shows us that Jesus is greater than Moses. He encourages us and warns us to not harden our hearts like those who came out of Egypt in the Exodus. And he asks us to be diligent, for God's rest is still available to us. And then a large portion of the book, chapters 4 to 10, is just this lengthy argument. He's arguing that Jesus is the true high priest. And so we need to follow Jesus because he is the true high priest. He encourages us again to stay faithful, for God's promises are certain. Then he sort of gives this proof, if you will, that Jesus is the high priest and that through Jesus' blood, forgiveness is bought once and for all. So he makes this whole argument, say Jesus, 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 Jesus. And then we get to chapter 10 where we picked up last week, and then it just becomes this encouragement and this warning of, hey, just follow Christ. Don't abandon Christ. Stay with Jesus. We saw last week he tells us, hey, be the church. He says, gather together. Don't neglect to be together and worship Jesus and to do good things. And then we saw at the end of last week in chapter 10:39, he says, do not shrink back. And then today we get to chapter 11, much of which we will skip, but he gives this encouragement, hey, what we need to do now is to look back at those who have persevered in the faith. And so that's essentially the meaning of the message today. So I kind of just spoiled it for you. But he tells us to look back and persevere at those, or to look and persevere at those who have in our faith. Hopefully, a quick overview can kind of just help you see and kind of catch you up to where we are. I don't know if you've ever heard someone say this, but it's like, hey, if you don't know what you're reading, read the page before and the page after. That's a really helpful thing. It doesn't always work, but it really helps sometimes to understand what you're reading. That's what we just did, but at like hyper speed. But in short, this letter of Hebrews is an argument on why it's true that Jesus is the Messiah and how his sacrifice is sufficient and the rightful replacement to the old covenant. Honestly, sometimes I struggle with this because we didn't live in that time, so we didn't know what it was like to live and experience the old covenant, to worship Jesus at the temple, or to worship God. They didn't know Jesus yet, to worship God at the temple and all these sorts of things. And so sometimes for me personally, and I think even maybe for all of us, it can be hard to even just like relate to what's going on because the writer comes in and he's like, hey, like all this stuff isn't useless, but yet at the same time, it's all changing because now we're worshiping through Christ. And so try to put yourself in the shoes of like what it would be like to just have like someone come in and be like, hey, we're doing it all differently now. But the writer's saying because Jesus is the Christ, because he is the one, he is the Messiah, and he uses Old Testament language that would make sense to them. He calls him the true high priest. We need to cling oh so close to Jesus, not anyone or anything else. And there were these strong temptations to abandon Christ. Or as we've been saying, give up. Grant has been here week after week encouraging us that through the book of Hebrews, it's a reminder to not give up. The desire to give up is because you have some variation of one of these three things, I think, when you read Hebrews. You can nuance it a little more, but for the most part, it's one of these three things. They just weren't convinced that Jesus was Jesus. They weren't convinced that he was the Messiah for whatever reason. They didn't want to give up what they were doing, or they just didn't believe it was true, or whatever. There was the allure of sin. Most specifically, unrepentant sin that was in their life. This kept them from following Jesus the way that they should. We saw that most specifically last week. And then there was just outside pressure and persecution. All the way from maybe they just had to sell their stuff. They were forced to give their possessions up. All the way to they were killed for their faith. So one of these three things was the temptation, is what causes temptation to just give up and be like, Jesus, I don't think you're the guy. But because of this, the writer is giving us a huge encouragement and in a way a warning. Do not give up. In Hebrews, he says it this way, essentially just keep your faith. Hold on to your faith. Endure in your faith. Last week, Joe took us through a hard text that gave us a warning about the danger of just letting sin sit in our lives and in our hearts, especially when sin is unrepentant and we just don't confront that sin that is in our lives. We talked about how we all will probably experience a time of drifting. Sometimes the drifting is way more drifting further than we ever thought it could be. But then closing out the chapter, he gives this battle cry, in a way, sort of reminder. In 10:39, he says, we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. And I love this verse because, I'm one of those people who loves the cheesy motivational things, like the speeches and the quips and all that stuff. That stuff gets me going. And so this verse anyway, it's don't shrink back. I'm like, yes, let's do it, which in and of itself is not enough, but it is helpful for me. And so I just love that call that he gives us. But here's the thing, we all have moments of weak faith, we just do, where our faith seems to sometimes even almost completely defeat her. And it can be in a number of ways. I've had many of these struggles myself through different types of things. I personally, and I'm grateful for this, I don't say this in a prideful way, but I'm just thankful. I personally have never really struggled with a sort of intellectual type of doubt where I'm just is God real? I don't know. That's never really been a challenge for me. I know many people who it has been a challenge for, and it's tough. I've had some occasional thoughts where gosh, do we really know what heaven's like? Do we really know that it's real? I've had those thoughts before, and it can kind of stir you up and cause some problems sometimes. But I've had moments of extremely weak faith. One, just from sin in my life for years of a struggle with pornography before God finally freed me for that. And just the weakness that causes in you and all sorts of other areas of your life. It's not just a thing that you do, but it affects your relationships, it affects your way of thinking, and just, man. And I've had moments where my faith was very weak because of that. I have had strong emotional doubts. And what I mean by that is just this idea of, man, do I really want to do this? Is following God really worth it? Is it worth all this trouble? Because following Jesus is not easy. I do believe he loves us and he has blessings for us, but it's just not always convenient, right? From October of 2023 to July of 2024, I had a really, really strong just battle with anxiety. And it still affects me now, but in that short period is when it was awful. And it was hard to function in many ways. And for me, I'm not going to get into all the details, but for me, it was very much connected to faith in religious things. And then as someone who worked in a church, there was a natural tension there. It's okay, well, if in a way this is causing my struggle and then I have to go to church every day and work in ministry, I don't want to do that because this is causing me anxiety. And so it just became tough, and it was hard on our marriage because I was just a mess, and Emily was having to pick up the pieces. And man, I just had many days where I was what if I just literally moved and just did something else and didn't work in a church, and I kind of just forgot about it. Those are thoughts that you have. My point being is our faith can be rocked. Our faith can be rocked. It can be rocked by us, something that you've done, a mistake that you've made, or it can be rocked by something else, something outside of us. And then sometimes the biggest issue becomes not the situation itself, but the belief that you develop about the situation, which often is just that hope is lost, right? You're well, I don't know what to do anymore, and so you just want to give up. And that's kind of how that process of drifting goes. And your circumstances seem impossible to overcome. You're like, I don't know how God can fix this one. Or your sin seems impossible to overcome. You're like, well, God can't fix me. I continue to screw up, right? But here's the good news in everything. The mysterious author that we don't know of Hebrews, he doesn't leave us empty-handed. So he doesn't tell us, hey, don't shrink back, have faith. All right, see you later, right? No, in chapter 11, he gives us this huge wealth of encouragement to persevere in our faith. Before we get to our main text in 32, I do want to look at verses 1 and 2. It will be on the screen. These verses are extremely crucial to understanding the entire book of Hebrews. So look with me, Hebrews 11, 1 and 2. He says, now faith, this is coming right off of his exclamation of, don't shrink back. And then he says this, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we don't see. This is what the ancients were commended for. So this, like I said, is an extremely helpful verse. So sometimes when we use the word faith, we use it in like multiple ways. We use the same word, but we kind of mean different things. And I think it's important to talk through this, especially as we read Hebrews, where the word faith is used like 1,000 times. So usually you hear faith sometimes in this like general sense, where it's like the entirety of all that we believe and do, like as Christians. It's the Christian faith. The faith of Christianity, in a similar way that you would say like the faith of Buddhism or something like that, right? It's all that we are. And then you have the sense of faith that is a little bit more what I think he uses here, which is essentially the act of trusting in something, or what I would like to say more specifically an outcome, that you don't have 100% tangible access to. Because that outcome is in the future. So when something's in the future, it's hard to have this 100% confident, tangible knowledge or access because you're like, I just don't know. Like, I can't see the future, right? To put it simply, it's just trusting that God will hold his promise. Like, this is what having faith in many ways is. And then in verse 2, he says very quickly, this is what the ancients were commended for. And this right here is what this whole chapter is about. Pointing us to those who have kept the faith. And some of them in like absolutely wild circumstances. And to remind us of those who did not shrink back. This is incredibly important because personally, I think this is sort of a lost art in our culture today. I love my generation dearly. One of the things my generation struggles with is that anything that's old, we're like, bah, we don't need it, and we just throw it out. And we're like, we know better. We have the internet. We have AI. We can figure it out for ourselves, right? And I understand the sentiment of that, but to just assume that all that came before us is bad is a really unhealthy way to be, and I think this chapter shows us that. We just like to toss it out, but Hebrews says to that, no ma'am and no sir. Like, we need to look back. We have so much to learn from our brothers and sisters and our forefathers. And so here's our larger point for today, and to put it in a cheesy way, it's to remember our heroes. To remember our heroes. You know why you can fight your faith, or for your faith, I should say. You know why you don't have to shrink back? Because you stand on a mountain of incredible men and women who, in spite of insane circumstances, kept their faith, did not shrink back, and carried the banner to continue on the gospel. Like, we stand on a mountain, and we do not only remember for the sake of it, but we remember to learn. So with that, let's look at verse 32. So jump to the end of the chapter. This is our main text for the day. Verse 32, we'll read through 35. The first thing the writer says, and what more shall I say? I'm not going to stop this often, but I do want to stop there. Before this, he mentions so many of the main characters of the Bible, Noah and Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and just all these guys who God used to do incredible, faithful things. And he's already like listed a bunch. And so he gets to this point and he's just like, what else? Like, what more do I have to tell you? Basically is what he's saying here. But he continues on to do it anyway. So he says, I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. So as we remember and learn from our heroes, the first thing we see in this text is that faith conquers over desperate circumstances. Faith conquers over desperate circumstances. So I'm going to just kind of read a survey, some of these things that the writer mentioned. He said, who through faith conquered kingdoms. You could give a bunch of examples. One is Gideon, who in the book of Judges, with only 300 men, defeated an entire army of the country of Midian. And he doubted. Who shut the mouths of lions. This references many things. Samson defeated a lion. David as well. I think most specifically we think of Daniel, right? Daniel was thrown into the lion's den to be killed and eaten. And guess what? God shut the mouths of lions and spared Daniel because of his faith. He quenched the fury of the flames. Most famously, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they refused to bow down and worship King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were thrown into the fire. And then what? There was a fourth figure in the fire, and they were saved and spared. They escaped the edge of the sword. Numerous examples. I think of two specifically. David escaped Saul, like so close, like he was about to be killed, and God spared him. We also have Elijah, whose life was spared when he escaped from Jezebel, and then whose weakness was turned to strength. And I mean, right here, just literally virtually any Bible character that you read about, they are weak in so many ways, and God turns it into strength. As a pastor, I'm not going to lie, I struggle sometimes to say blanket things like this. I personally am not a very black and white person. And so sometimes I don't like getting up here and just being like, boom, like here's the thing that you need to know. And I just, your circumstances might be extremely desperate. Like, I don't know. And so I can struggle sometimes and want to be like, hey, God's going to conquer, like it'll be all right, because I don't want to come off insensitive. I prefer personally just sit down and like actually talk through things and go through the nuance of what your situation might be. But I do believe it to be true. I do believe it to be true. And I want to point out in context of learning and remembering our heroes is that those around you, these people serve as an example, but the people around you can see the light at the end of the tunnel when you can't. Like, this is one of the best parts about being in community, having people who came before us. It's like they can see the light at the end of the tunnel when you can't. And I've used this illustration before, but when the anxiety that I had was just like at its peak, well, I guess this was after the fact. Maybe a year after the fact, my wife and I were talking about it, and so I said October of 23 to about July of 24, we were talking about just my journey in it, and I was like, I don't feel like anything realistically started to change until about May or April of 2024. And she was like, that's funny, because I felt like you turned a corner in January. And I was like, oh, well, I guess that's good, But that's what community is, right? Like, it helps us see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel when we don't. Like, in January, I was like, that's it. Like, all hope's lost. I'm never going to recover. And my wife is patiently, gently sitting there going, it's going to get there. You just can't see it yet. And this is what God does when he brings us other people. He brings us community. He puts us in a church, right? For this purpose to happen, we can look back at the people before us. Like, imagine the circumstances when Daniel was literally thrown in the lion's den. Like, what if you're standing at the top, you're like, hey, bro, it's going to be all right, that would be tough, right? But those around us can see the light at the end of the tunnel. What we also learn from this set of verses is that faith conquers over desperate circumstances, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit to verse 32, but faith conquers over our many imperfections. Faith conquers over our many imperfections. So there's another important thing to point out about all these people and instances that the writer pointed out here. Here's some things we know about the names that he mentioned. Samson. So Samson, if you don't know the story of Samson, Judges 13 to 16, I encourage you to go read it. It's like reading Shakespeare. It's crazy. But Samson made a Nazirite vow with God, which was the strongest covenant that you could make with God, and he broke it multiple times, most specifically through sexual promiscuity with Delilah. Gideon in his doubt demanded signs from God. He was like, over and over, he was like, God, prove to me that this is you telling me this, which is something that many of us would advise against doing today. But not only that, after their military victory, he took some of the plunder and he created an ephod with it, and then it became an idol and led Israel to sin after God delivered them. Barak was too scared to fight on his own without Deborah. God was calling him to go into battle, and he was like, nope. I need somebody to come with me. And then thankfully through Deborah, God delivered them in the battle. Jephthah also had a great military victory, but he vowed to sacrifice his own daughter. David, he mentions David. We know the famous incident, David and Bathsheba. But not only that, David had other instances of weaknesses. At the end of Chronicles and Kings, you see this moment of pride that David's had, which is where he counts his army. And it's just for no other reason other than he can show that he's powerful. And God did not like when he did that. And then even Samuel's a little harder to find fault. Specifically, but Samuel had two sons that rose up and they were extremely corrupt. And they led Israel into sin. So even Samuel, we were like, man, he did everything right. Like even his sons, like it's like, well, I mean, he wasn't perfect, as neither are us. But why are these people in this chapter? Not because of any of that stuff, but because of their faith, right? Even so, they are not remembered from the author by their flaws, but are commended for their perseverance. They sinned, yet their lives were marked by faith. Tom Schreiner, he's a New Testament scholar, he said it this way: still, it is not the sins and faults of these men that are remembered, but their faith and trust in God. Here's the key part: showing that perseverance and faith for the author is not the same thing as perfection. Indeed, one may sin dramatically and still persevere in faith. And of course, this is very connected to the truth that they all received a promise, and that promise was fulfilled. Many of these people you can go back and read, and at the beginning of their story, God gave them a promise, and then their life went like this. And then sure enough, years later, God came through on that promise. So I want to mention again this idea. It's like, what do we mean when we say we got to have faith and endure in faith, these sort of things? I don't want it to be super abstract. When we say faith conquers, it's not just a sense of believing harder. I think sometimes that's kind of how we take it. It's like, I need to have more faith. And it's like, Like I feel like, at least myself, that's how I picture when I'm encouraged, like, just have more faith. It's like, okay, do I just sit here and go, and like manifest more faith? I don't think so. But I understand that sentiment. But here's the thing, to me, it's an impossible thing to quantify, and therefore can be very confusing. So when we look at the evidence that the writer gives us, all these people that he mentions, here's what we see faith to be: continuing to move forward and do the right thing no matter what. Like it's that simple. Continuing to move forward and do the right thing no matter what. This is how our faith conquers. To do what the Bible tells you to do, to go where the Holy Spirit tells you to go, and to believe what the Bible says, no matter how hard it may be. However, this doesn't mean that we don't ask for help. I believe faith is largely held in this way, but there is a sense in which we need emotional dependence on God. The most famous example, Mark 9:34, the desperate father who needs the healing for his son comes to Jesus, and he says, Jesus, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. And so if you feel your faith is weak, I encourage you to be like the father and get on your knees and ask God to grant it. And so as we move forward when things are tough, when our circumstances are crazy, when the sin is in our life, we have this kind of dual nature of like, I need to just do my best to do the things that God has asked me to do. Understand that I do believe no matter how weak it feels, and in that unbelief, ask God to help me and strengthen me. This is how our faith conquers. But it doesn't stop there. Let's keep going. Look at verse 36. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. So from these two verses, we see that faith conquers over evil and darkness. It truly does. Faith conquers over evil and darkness. It's pretty self-explanatory. So what I want to do, I just want to read a couple things to you that's encouraging to me. Some of the early martyrs are just such a rock for our faith. Polycarp, he was the bishop of Smyrna in 155 AD. He was brought before the Roman government, and they asked him to recant his faith. And here's what he said. He said, 86 years I have served my God, and he has done me no wrong. How can then I now blaspheme my King and Savior? And then sure enough, they killed him. Justin Martyr, who was one of the first church apologists, he wrote a letter to the emperor telling him, and also kind of to his congregation, he says, remember, brothers and sisters, they can kill us, but they cannot hurt us. Just what a great encouragement that is. And so we see from all of these people in Scripture who came before us, from our heroes, our forefathers, that faith conquers over evil and darkness. If the readers expected, so you and I, the audience of Hebrews, if we expected to be accepted and praised, we need to rethink matters again in light of our Old Testament fathers. Easiness and comfort was never anticipated to be the goal. However, we know that in the midst of all of that, God wins. God wins. And here's how we know that. Look at verse 39 and 40. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them had received what was promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they will be made perfect. And here's our final point. Faith conquers because the promise has come. Faith conquers because the promise has come. And here's what's just so incredible, that I really want you to try and put yourself in their shoes. All these people that are mentioned, the names that I just mentioned, they didn't have the full picture, and yet they still endured in their faith. They still held. They didn't know. They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know exactly what God was up to. They knew God was up to something. He had made them some promises, but they didn't really know. They certainly weren't sure, I think you could argue. But because God is good, they trusted that promise. And here's what the author means by saying they hadn't yet received the promise. This is kind of the one sort of theological thing I want to point out. God has something better for us, and it is Jesus. It's the kingdom. It's the resurrection. The resurrection gives the guarantee of the future. And this is what it means to say that when he compares us to them, that we have a better promise. They had not yet seen the resurrection. They didn't know that it was coming. They weren't even really sure what the Messiah was supposed to be. I think there's also a historical argument to be made that they didn't even know if Jesus was going to raise from the dead. And sure enough, he did. And so our promise is better in the sense that we have experienced this, not in like literal FaceTime, like we weren't there when the resurrection happened, but because of it, we know that God's promises are real. And it also tells us that his sacrifice is final, and we don't need another one. And the beauty is this, is that our faith is not blind and it is not empty. The Christian faith is the Christian faith because it's rooted in a real God who has made and held real promises. And those promises are proved by the resurrection. So earlier I talked about these two meanings of faith. Like we have this general sense of faith as the Christian faith, and then we have this other meaning of faith as the act of trusting in the outcome that we don't have access to. And I think what the author in a way is telling us is that through the resurrection, these two things come together. The Christian faith isn't just a set of values, set of ethics, philosophies, set of hopes or traditions or anything like that will just, hey, well, if we do this, maybe the world will be a better place. No, the Christian faith is itself the belief and trust in the resurrection of Christ that has proven that everything else will be as God said it to be. Faith conquers because the promise has come, and it is sealed, and it is guaranteed, and nothing can take that away from me or from you. And just as Jesus told Peter in Matthew 16, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And guess what? Here we are 2,000 years later with the church alive and well. Like the church has problems, sure, but God is moving and he's growing his church and he's doing phenomenal things. We can even see that here in our own midst. Jesus gave a promise that his church will conquer, and I believe that it has, and it will continue to do so. So essentially our conclusion of this, we're remembering our heroes and we're learning from them. So we have these ideas. In our desperate circumstances, faith conquers. and your unpaid bills, and your rejected job interviews, and your chronic illness, and your marriage tension, and your divorce. Like whatever the thing is, however desperate it may feel, faith conquers these things. And your imperfections, and your lying, and your cheating, and your anxiety, your depression, your lust, your gender dysphoria, your anger, your loneliness, your doubts, your fears. Faith conquers these things. Over evil and darkness, the attacks of Satan onto you and onto others, the wars that we see in the world, the economic instability, the flat-out injustice and oppression that is everywhere, faith conquers over them. And this faith conquers because the promise has come, and therefore we don't shrink back because we have the resurrection. So I made this statement earlier that we stand on a mountain of incredible men and women who did not shrink back and have carried the banner of faith. And if you've never considered that idea, that you are here because God used people before you, whether you know them directly or not, I really think you need to reflect on that truth. As believers now, we are part of an incredibly long history of faith, one that is beautiful, one that has its faults, but one that is life-changing. The faith itself does not have its faults, but some of us have made mistakes with our faith. Let me clarify there. But what a joy and honor and blessing it is to be included amongst these heroes who carried the torch fearlessly for Christ's kingdom. We certainly do not deserve it, but God in his grace has given it to us. So here's what I'm going to close with. Is I'm just going to survey my heroes, those who have encouraged and continue to encourage me. And in me doing that, in my hopes that it will inspire and encourage you to do the same. And I would even push you can think about it, reflect on it now, and as you go beyond today, to really think about it later today. And even if there's someone in your life now, give them a call and thank them. And just be appreciative for the impact that they've made in their life, even if they don't know that they have. So here's mine. Some of these are people that I know personally, and some of these are historical people. But the martyrs of the faith, I already mentioned Justin Martyr. Another one of my favorites is Ignatius of Antioch. In 107 AD, he was the bishop of Antioch. So he led the church there. He was going to Rome. They had taken him, and he was going to Rome to be killed. And his followers were sending him letters, and they're like, "Hey, Ignatius, we can get you out of this." And he responds by saying no. He's like, "Nope, this is my duty." And they were taking him specifically to feed him to wild animals, probably at the Colosseum, that still exists today, as entertainment. And this is what he says. He says, "Let me be food." He says, "I am God's wheat to be ground by the teeth of beasts, to be Christ's pure bread." After living a life of faith and knowing that Christ had died for him, he only saw it fitting to die for Christ. One of my favorites is John Wesley. His story is just absolutely incredible. Because of John Wesley, the entire Church of England, and then in many ways indirectly, the Church in America was just absolutely reformed in incredible ways. And John Wesley just had one of the most strong daily devotional lives of anyone who's ever existed, and he documented so much through daily journals, and so we know so much about his life because he just wrote down things every day that God was teaching him, that he was doing, and his story is just phenomenal. And he even set up what many of us would say today is like the modern version of small groups. He went around England and preaching, and people came to faith, and he started going, okay, well, how do we lead these people? And he's like, well, we're gonna organize this group in 1,000, and then in that group is like hundreds, and in that group's 10. And it's like basically modern small groups. And his just commitment's incredible. This is a little bit nerdy. One of my favorites is Blaise Pascal, who lived during the time of the Enlightenment, and he was just an incredible Christian, an incredible philosopher, an incredible scientist. So much of what we have in science and mathematics is because of Blaise Pascal. But he had this deep devotion to see people come to God, and one of the ways that he wanted to do that was integrating these intellectual things that he knew in the things that God had created in the faith that he had in Jesus. And he was one of the first people to articulate that in, I think, a way that is just very compelling, and I just am encouraged by that. Missionaries, I think of Lottie Moon. If you don't know Lottie Moon, if you're Southern Baptist, you probably heard that name. A main reason that there's even Christianity in China to this day is because of Lottie. She died from dementia and extreme starvation. When she died, she was only about 50 pounds because she was constantly giving her food away to starving Chinese. Just absolutely incredible. Jim and Elizabeth Elliott. Jim died in Ecuador in the 50s at the hands of a violent tribe he was trying to share the gospel with. 2 years later, his wife Elizabeth and their 3-year-old visited the island, forgave them, and then lived among them, saw the Bible translated into their language, which happened later, but saw them come to know Christ after they killed her husband. Just incredible. And then here's just some in my personal life. Pastor Robbie Gallaty, in a way, has been a huge encouragement to me. He's at Long Hollow Church in Nashville, Tennessee. The reason I bring his name up is because through one of his sermons is where I felt like God called me into ministry in 2017, and I'm so grateful for that. And then in October of 2022, when did we go? 2022? 2023? 2022. I got to meet Robbie in Nashville and just thank him for his service, and that he would have never known who I am, and just through his ministry, God has brought me here today, and grateful for him. Professor of philosophy, president of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, Dr. Jamie Dew. The impact he's had on my life, just through the way that he articulates and thinks about faith and intellectual things, and the way that carries into his daily life and his pastoral ministry, has absolutely radically changed the way that I think about myself, the way God has created me, and the way God wants me to do ministry. Very grateful for that. In many ways, my pastor's here. I'm thankful for Joe, 7 years ago, taking a chance on me as a graduate of LSU, no seminary experience yet, and bringing me here to allow me to serve and lead our college ministry. I'm thankful for getting to know Grant over the last few years. Grant just has a deep, deep, deep love for his people in a way that I admire and inspire to have. It's amazing to see. Bridgeway, just in many ways, I'm so grateful that I've been able to be here. I have friends here, the college students. I love our students. In many ways, our students are what gets me out of bed to keep me doing what I'm called to do. I'm going to call her out. I'm very thankful for Cammie and her service to our college ministry. About 3 years ago today, we had a coffee conversation where she thought I was just going to ask her to lead a small group or something. And I asked her to take a major step of faith, to leave her job at the university, to step into full-time ministry, to leave the benefits that she had at the university, to raise her salary, and to work for us here at Bridgeway. And 3 years later, it's been an awesome 3 years of ministry. Steve Masters. These are people you don't know, but I just feel it important to share that I think there's so many people in our lives who have been rocks for us. Steve is a legend in college ministry. He did college ministry for over 40 years. He just retired in this past summer. Over 33 of those years were at LSU. I was involved in the Baptist Collegiate Ministry at Louisiana State University. Because of Steve in that ministry, I stand before you here today. Adam Venters and his wife, Lindsay. Adam is a mentor of mine who I met when I was at LSU. His wife is Steve's daughter, so there's a lot of connections there. He is now a collegiate minister at the University of South Carolina. Adam, more than anyone, let me have it on multiple occasions. Told me where I was being a dunce. And I am so grateful for his willingness to call out the sin in my life and to lead me to where I am today. And then two more. My friend Brandon, he's my best friend from college, just been an incredible friend. He's one of the few men where it's just been me and him, and that man has seen me cry. So I'm just grateful for Brandon. He's a pastor in New Orleans. He's a pastor in the most true sense of the word. He cares for the lowest of the low. He puts himself in harmful situations to do that. It's amazing to see. And then, of course, my wife, Emily, too many things to say, but just grateful the way that she inspires me on in my faith. And so, guys, look, this is my encouragement to you today, to remember your heroes. Let's take the advice that the writer of Hebrews is giving us, and to think about and to look back on all of those who have carried the torch for us, all of those in our lives today who have got us to where we are. And so we're just going to close very simply. I'm going to pray, and then Joe's going to do announcements, and we're going to be dismissed. And my challenge for you today is to do that, to spend time thinking on those people and to give them a call and to let them know what they have done in your life through the grace of God.